The last time a human spoke during a full Galactic Council session, it had been a procedural correction about a misrecorded treaty date. That was 11 years ago. Before that, 9 years of silence. The species that built roads across continents and dug tunnels under oceans had, for 40 years, sat in the back of the most powerful governing body in the known galaxy and said almost nothing. Nobody found this strange anymore. That was the problem. Reinhold arrived at the council chamber the same way he always did. Alone. No aide, no assistant, no security. He walked the long corridor from the human quarters to the main hall with his hands in the pockets of his plain dark coat, nodding once to the door attendant, a four-armed being from the Thessali cluster who had worked this post for decades. The attendant nodded back. They had never exchanged names. The chamber was already filling when Ren took his seat. The human position was in the lower tier, near the back, slightly to the left of center. It was not a position of importance. When Earth had joined the Council 40 years ago, the seat assignment had been presented as temporary, pending review. The review had never come. Ren had stopped expecting it. He opened his notebook. Paper. Real paper, which several delegates over the years had commented on with the particular kind of amusement people reserve for things they consider backwards. Ren had never explained the choice. The reason was simple. Paper could not be remotely accessed, copied, or erased. Today's session was about the Drell asteroid belt, a dense mineral field sitting at the outer edge of what the Council's navigation charts marked as human-adjacent space. The Vorath Dominion wanted mining rights. The Pelhari Collective wanted transit authority. Two smaller species had filed competing resource claims that nobody in power was taking seriously. Griv took the central speaking platform before the session was formally opened. This was technically against procedure. Nobody said anything. He was tall even for a Vorath, pale blue-gray with long, thin fingers that moved constantly when he talked, like he was conducting something only he could hear. His voice filled the chamber without effort. The asteroid belt, Griv said, had been sitting unclaimed for long enough. The Vorath Dominion had the infrastructure, the workforce, and the political standing to develop it responsibly. He used the word responsibly 4 times in 6 sentences. Ren wrote down the number. The debate that followed was loud and, to Ren's eye, entirely predictable. The Pelhari pushed back on transit access. The smaller species made their cases and were talked over. Various delegates checked communications on their personal devices while others were speaking. One representative from the Mulan Trade Circle fell asleep and was gently nudged awake by a colleague. At one point, Griv turned from the platform and let his eyes move across the lower tier. They stopped on the human seat. He smiled, which on a Vorath face was not a warm expression. "I notice our human colleagues are present in body today," Griv said. "As always." He paused for effect. "It is a comfort to know the mute species continues to attend, even if attending is all they do." The chamber laughed. Not everyone, but enough. A ripple of sound moving through the tiers like something had been thrown into water. Ren did not look up from his notebook. He wrote one word, underlined it, and turned the page. Across the chamber, in the aide section reserved for junior staff, a young being named San watched the human delegate with amber-colored eyes. San came from a small homeworld with a name the Council routinely mispronounced. He had been working as a junior aide for 2 years, and in that time had developed the habit of watching the humans whenever Griv made his jokes. He expected to see embarrassment, or the careful blankness that small species learn to wear in the chamber. What he saw instead was something he did not have a word for at first. Reinhold looked the way someone looks when they are watching a process they already understand complete itself. Patient. Certain. Like a person waiting for water to boil, who already knows the water will boil. The vote on the asteroid belt passed in Vorath favor. The 2 smaller species claims were tabled for further review, which in council language meant they would not be discussed again for years. The session closed. Ren closed his notebook. He stood, put on his coat, and walked toward the exit. San moved quickly through the aide corridor and came out near the main hall doors. He had not planned what he was going to say. He just walked up beside the human delegate and kept pace. "You are not angry," San said. Ren glanced at him. "No." He called your species mute, in session, on record. "Yes." San waited. Ren kept walking. They were almost at the corridor that split toward the human quarters. "Why do you not speak?" San asked. "You have the channel, you have the right, every session nothing." Ren stopped. He looked at San for a moment, not unkindly. "We are still deciding," Ren said, "whether it is worth the effort." He walked on. San stood in the corridor and watched him go. The words did not sound like an excuse. They sounded like something far more careful than that. They sounded like a conclusion that had not yet been delivered. That night in Geneva, Director Aiko Sato read the session report alone in her office with one lamp on. She read to the bottom. She found the line she was looking for. She drew a red mark under it. Then she picked up the secure line and called Admiral Rourke. She did not say hello. She said, "How long until the fleet is ready?" Rourke answered without hesitation. She said, "Start the count." She turned off the lamp. The motion was introduced on a Thursday. By Friday it had a vote count. By the following Monday it was law. Resolution 7. Gamma reclassified 3 human colony worlds, Varda, Solis Reach, and the settlement on Outer Keen, as unaligned frontier zones. The language was clean and procedural. Frontier zones were not enemy territory. They were simply no longer protected. Any registered species could file a development claim. Any registered fleet could enter without council challenge. It was, in the technical reading, not an act of aggression. Ren Holt read the motion text 3 times on the morning it was filed. Then he sent one message to Director Sato. It contained 4 characters. She replied with 2. Varda had 11,000 people. Solis Reach had closer to 30. Outer Keen was newer, smaller, a research and agricultural outpost with about 4,000 residents and a landing strip that flooded during rain season. None of the 3 worlds had strategic value by any meaningful military measure. They had no rare minerals, no key transit position, no political weight. They had people, that was what they had. The session to vote on 7 Gamma was held in the main chamber with standard attendance. Griv arrived early. He sat in the Vorith primary seat and talked to his aides at a volume that carried across 2 tiers. He seemed pleased. He had been pleased all week. The debate lasted 40 minutes. Several delegates spoke in favor, citing frontier development policy and the inefficiency of protecting uninhabited or lightly settled zones. 2 delegates from smaller species raised objections and were answered with procedural points that took 3 times as long as the objections themselves. Then the speaking channel from the human seat activated. The tone was soft, a single chime, routine in theory but in practice something that had not happened in over a decade. The chamber registered it the way any large body of beings registers a sudden change in a familiar pattern. Heads turned. Voices dropped. Within a few seconds the hall had gone quieter than it usually got even for Chancellor Bohr. Ren stood. He did not look at Griv. He did not look at Bohr. He looked at the record console at the center of the hall, the one that logged all official statements for the permanent archive. Earth objects to this resolution, he said, and considers it an act of provocation. He sat down. Nobody spoke for 3 full seconds. Griv recovered first. He leaned back in his seat and smiled the wide Vorith smile that showed the secondary teeth. "Well," he said, loudly enough for the gallery, 11 years and that is what we get. Very dramatic, very human." He gestured toward the vote panel. "Shall we proceed?" The chamber laughed again. Harder this time, or perhaps it only felt harder. The vote passed, 41 in favor, 6 against including Earth, 4 abstentions. Ren wrote 2 words in his notebook. He did not close it this time. He sat with it open in front of him and watched the vote totals display on the chamber board until the session was formally ended. Son did not laugh. He had not laughed the last time either. He watched the human delegate from across the hall and felt something he could not properly name. It was not pity. It was something more like the feeling of watching a storm form on a horizon that everyone else had their backs to. That night, 3 things happened at the same time. On Earth's orbital station, Admiral Rourke stood in the command center and watched the fleet displays. The ships had been in cold standby for years, listed on Council registry as Reserve Patrol Class, old models, low priority. What was waking up now was not that. The hull lights came on in sequence, row after row. The station crew worked quietly. Rourke checked items off a physical list, one by one, and did not speak except to confirm readings. At the Council Neutral Zone station, Myra Voss received a message on her personal device. She read it twice. She looked around her lab once at the samples on the bench, the work half finished, the notes on the wall she had been adding to for 2 years. Then she reached under her desk and pulled out a bag she had packed 3 weeks ago. She walked to the docking bay. She did not leave a note. And across 11 worlds where human diplomatic stations operated, every human diplomat sent an identical message to their host governments at the same moment. The message was short. It said, "Please review your existing treaties with Earth at your earliest opportunity. They are about to change." On most worlds, the messages were flagged as unusual and passed to senior staff. On 2 worlds, they were initially mistranslated and caused brief confusion. On 1 world, a senior government official read the message, read it again, and immediately called her defense minister. Nobody called Earth for clarification. Which was, in a way, the point. San read the message text the next morning when it appeared in an internal council briefing summary. He read it 3 times. Then he looked up the record log from yesterday's session and listened to Ren's statement again through his earpiece. Earth objects to this resolution and considers it an act of provocation. 14 words, spoken in a level voice, no emotion, no drama. He thought about the way Ren had looked when he closed his notebook. Not defeated, not angry. Done waiting. Earth stayed silent too long, until the council crossed the line. The intelligence analyst who first put the full picture together was a Pelhari named Asa. She had been doing routine cross-referencing of member state industrial outputs as part of a standard economic review. The kind of work nobody senior paid attention to. The kind of work that sometimes, quietly, changed everything. She flagged the anomaly internally on a Wednesday. By Friday, it had reached 4 different desks. By the following week, a private meeting had been called in one of the council building's smaller conference rooms, the ones without gallery access, without press registration, without the kind of record-keeping that applied to official sessions. 7 analysts sat around the table, 5 species represented. Asa put the compiled data on the shared display. She did not editorialize. She just walked through the numbers. Every species that had joined the Galactic Council in the modern era had reduced military-industrial output within the first decade of membership. It was not a written rule. It was simply what happened. Joining the Council meant joining a system. The system provided protection, trade access, dispute resolution. In exchange, member states gradually became part of the structure rather than independent powers preparing for independent threats. It was a kind of institutional gravity. Earth had joined 40 years ago. Earth had not reduced output. The numbers on the display showed human industrial production running at what Asa's model estimated as wartime levels, sustained continuously for 4 decades, not increasing dramatically, not announcing itself, just running, steady, like a machine that had been set going and never turned off. Nobody had asked about it because Earth paid its council dues without complaint, attended every session, filed every required report, and caused no trouble. The monitoring resources that might have caught the pattern were directed at species that caused problems. Earth was not a species that caused problems. Until now, the assumption had been that the human fleet on Council registry was accurate. Reserve Patrol class, older models, standard configuration. The register had not been independently verified in 31 years because there had been no reason to verify it. Then the new ships appeared near Earth's orbital station. Someone at the table said the word that everyone was thinking. Asa put the estimated count on the display. The room was quiet for a moment. "How was this missed?" said one of the analysts. Not a question exactly, more like something said out loud because it needed to be. "We watch species that cause problems," Asa said. "Earth did not cause problems." Another analyst pulled up secondary data. Earth's navigation mapping records, submitted as required by Council protocol, had been complete and timely for 40 years. What the secondary data showed was that the submissions had included something extra. Embedded in the routine mapping files, updated quietly with each submission, was a secondary dataset. Shipping lanes, fuel depot locations, supply chain nodes, military installation positions for every major Council power. Documented with the same precise, methodical patience as everything else Earth submitted. It was not hidden. It was simply filed in a category that nobody reviewed closely because the primary data was always accurate and on time. One analyst from the Moulin Circle leaned back and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "They have been watching us the same way we assumed we were watching them." Across the building, in his quiet office, San had received a copied version of Asa's summary through a channel he was not entirely certain was secure. He read it twice. He thought about Reinholdt's face in the chamber. Patient. Certain. Like someone watching water that already knows it will boil. He thought about his homeworld. About the resource complaint that had been procedurally blocked 4 times across 6 years. About the session where a senior delegate had spoken over the homeworld's representative for 11 consecutive minutes without being interrupted by the chair. He opened a drawer. He took out a small data drive. He looked at it for a moment. Then he began copying. What he was doing had a name in Council regulations. The name was not good. He was aware of this. He copied the file anyway, all of it. The full 40-year mapping data, the industrial output analysis, Asa's summary, 3 years of related intelligence briefs that had been quietly accumulated and never escalated. He walked down the long, empty corridor toward the press office. The corridor had no cameras in this section. He had checked. He slid the drive under the door of a journalist he had spoken to exactly twice, a being from a neutral world with a reputation for careful sourcing. He walked back. His hands were steady. He sat at his desk and went back to his normal work and did not tell anyone. 3 days later, Chancellor Bohr called an emergency session. His face on the announcement feed looked like a being carrying something heavy who had been carrying it for some time and was not sure how much further he could go. Griv was the first to send a response. He sent it publicly. It called for Earth to be formally sanctioned, the fleet reviewed, the diplomatic staff recalled. Ren read the message in his quarters. He set it aside. He picked up his notebook. He reviewed his notes from the last 40 years, a practice he had maintained monthly since arriving at the Council. He found the page he wanted. He read it once. He put the notebook in his coat pocket. He was ready. Earth stayed silent too long, until the Council crossed the line. The chamber was the fullest it had been in years. The upper gallery, normally half empty, had beings packed into every available seat. Press credentials had been issued at 3 times the usual rate. Delegations that rarely sent full representation had arrived with every member present. Even the aide section, where San sat with his notepad and his careful amber eyes, was crowded in a way it almost never was. Chancellor Bohr called the session to order. His voice was steady, but his movements were slower than usual. He announced that the session was called to address concerns regarding Earth's military posture and recent statements. He invited Earth's delegate to speak to the matter. This was a formality, an invitation to explain, to apologize, to reduce tension. Ren Holt activated his speaking channel. He stood. He spoke for 22 minutes. His voice did not change in those 22 minutes, not louder, not softer, not faster or slower. The same level, clear tone from the first sentence to the last, which was its own kind of unsettling. The chamber had heard emotional speeches. It had heard angry speeches. It had heard speeches designed to perform passion for the gallery feeds. This was none of those things. This was something that felt more like a door opening onto a room that had been locked for a very long time. He began with a date 40 years ago. The session where Earth's first colonial survey rights request had been procedurally delayed. He gave the resolution number, the vote count, the stated reason for delay, and the actual reason, which he read from internal notes that had since become part of the press record thanks to a journalist on a neutral world. He moved forward year by year, not every year, only the ones that mattered, the protection requests that had been tabled, the species that had asked for intervention and received language instead of action. The times a powerful member had violated a trade agreement and the council had recorded it as a misunderstanding. The pattern was not complicated. It did not require interpretation. It simply required someone to say it out loud in sequence in a room where it could not be ignored. When he finished the history, he stated two things. The three human colony worlds of Varda, Soli's Reach, and Outer Keen were under Earth's direct military protection effective immediately. Any vessel approaching those worlds without human authorization would be turned back. This was not negotiable and not subject to council review. Earth was formally requesting a full structural audit of the council's voting procedures, resource treaty history, and enforcement record for the past 40 years. Earth was submitting the supporting documentation today. All of it, publicly. He sat down. The chamber did not move for several seconds. Then Griv stood. The Vorith delegate's skin had darkened around the jaw. His long fingers were very still, which for Griv was itself unusual. When he spoke, his voice was the loudest it had ever been in a session, which was saying something. He said Ren's statement was a declaration of war. He said Earth had revealed itself as a destabilizing force that had been hiding its true nature for 40 years. He demanded Earth be suspended from council membership pending a full security review. He looked around the chamber for support and found several delegates already signaling agreement. Bohr looked down at the floor for a moment. Then he looked at the human seat. "Does the Earth delegation wish to respond to the characterization?" Bohr said. Ren looked at Griv, just looked at him. "No," Ren said. "A declaration of war would have looked different. You would have known before I finished the first sentence." Griv opened his mouth. Then he closed it. In 11 years of observing council sessions, San had never seen Griv fail to finish a sentence. He wrote it down in his notepad and underlined it twice. The session did not resolve that day. It could not. Too much had been said, too much documentation had entered the public record, and too many smaller delegations were quietly requesting recesses to consult with their home governments. The suspension motion that Griv pushed for failed to reach a vote when two of his expected allies abstained without explanation. After the session ended, San waited near the lower-tier exit. He told himself he was not waiting for Ren specifically. But when Ren came through, the door, San fell into step beside him without planning to. 22 minutes, San said. "Yes." "You had it prepared, all of it, every number, every date." "Yes." They walked a few steps. The corridor was emptying around them. "How long have you been preparing that?" San asked. Ren thought about it. 31 years, he said. "The first 15 I was still hopping, I would not need it." San was quiet for a moment. Then he said, My homeworld filed a resource complaint 6 years ago. It was blocked every time. Ren stopped walking. He turned and looked at San properly. I know, Ren said. It is in the documentation. San stood there. Something in his chest felt like a window opening. What happens now? He said. Ren looked back down the corridor toward the chamber. Now, he said, everyone decides who they actually are. He walked on. San stood and watched him go and felt, for the first time in a long time, something that was not entirely hopeless. Earth stayed silent too long, until the Council crossed the line. The first species to make contact was a small homeworld called the Davari, whose delegate had been trying to get floor time in the Council chamber for 6 years. They sent a message to Earth's diplomatic station through a channel typically used for trade logistics, which was either a mistake or a careful choice. The message asked, very politely, if someone would be willing to listen. Earth Station replied within the hour, someone would be willing to listen. By the end of that first day, 4 more species had sent similar messages. By the end of the week, there were 19. They came through trade channels, through research network lines, through personal contacts between junior staff members who had been quietly talking for years. Some of the requests were formal. Some were barely coherent, sent by delegates who had not slept much and were not sure what they were asking for but knew they needed to ask. Earth's diplomatic staff did not promise anything. They did not offer protection or resources or guarantees. They offered something simpler. They listened fully, without checking devices or interrupting or looking toward the door. They asked follow-up questions. They took notes. They said, tell us more about that. They said, when did this begin? They said, we would like to understand what happened. For some of the delegates sitting across from them, this was the first time anyone with any power had said those words and appeared to mean them. One delegate from a water-world species cried during the second hour of her meeting, which seemed to surprise her more than anyone else. The human diplomat across the table passed her something to drink and waited. Meanwhile, in the space between Council territory and the human colony worlds, a line of Vorath warships had been moving for 2 days. They were not moving fast. Vorath military doctrine preferred deliberate approaches, position establishment, the kind of slow advance that communicated intent without triggering immediate response. There were 14 ships. They were well-armed and well-crewed. They had been ignoring Council hailing signals, which was a statement in itself. On the second day of their approach, something changed. Navigation data began appearing on the public broadcast channels used by independent shipping and small state vessels across the region. It appeared all at once, from no single source, distributed across hundreds of relay points simultaneously. It was Earth's 40-year mapping archive, released in full free access, no registration required. It included everything: shipping lanes, fuel depot locations, supply chain infrastructure, military installation positions, and embedded in a current status layer that had clearly been updated recently, the exact positions, headings, fuel levels, and estimated arrival times of the 14 Vorath warships. Every vessel within range could see them. Every small station, every independent trader, every minor state government monitoring the region. The Vorath fleet, which had been moving through space it considered effectively private, was suddenly visible to everyone. The fleet slowed on the third day, then it stopped. There was no confrontation. Earth ships did not move to intercept. No weapons were charged, no emergency signals sent. The Vorath fleet simply stopped in open space and held position, and the reason was obvious to anyone who understood how power actually worked. Being watched by everyone was not the same problem as facing one enemy. One enemy could be defeated. Everyone watching could not. Griv released a public statement calling the navigation data release an act of military espionage and demanding Council sanctions. 14 hours later, a journalist on a neutral world, published a full analysis of the data comparing it to the Council's own publicly filed navigation records, and found they matched almost perfectly. The Vorath fleet's position was not a secret Earth had stolen. It was a secret the Vorath had assumed nobody would bother to track. In the neutral zone station, Myra Voss had returned, not to her old lab, which had been logged as vacated during the unrest. She was working in a shared research bay that had 3 empty benches and a very good atmospheric processor. Within a week, the benches were not empty. 7 scientists from 5 different species arrived in 1s and 2s. 2 of them had been denied Council research grants without explanation. 1 had been waiting for equipment clearance for 3 years. 1 had simply heard through a colleague that there was space and someone willing to share data without asking for institutional credit in return. Myra made a lot of tea. She had brought an unreasonable quantity of tea from Earth and was apparently not sorry about this. She shared it freely. The scientist from the Waterworld species could not drink it but found the smell pleasant, which Myra said was good enough. They worked. Different fields, different methodologies, different ways of approaching a problem. It was messy and occasionally confusing, and completely without the procedural structure that the Council required for recognized research projects. It was also, 3 of the visiting scientists said independently to their home contacts, the most productive work environment they had been in for years. San received an offer of asylum from Earth's diplomatic station on a quiet Tuesday. It was written simply. It said Earth was aware of what he had done with the data drive and considered it an act of some courage. It said he was welcome. He looked at the message for a long time. Then he opened his desk drawer and took out 3 data drives he had been keeping for months. Council internal communications. Not stolen. Documented. He had been filing copies of things that crossed his desk that he thought someone, someday, should know about. He packed a small bag. He wrote a brief message to his homeworld's government. He left. Earth stayed silent too long, until the Council crossed the line. The audit motion came to a vote on a gray Tuesday with no gallery audience, because the press had been asked to wait outside and, unusually, had agreed. The chamber was quieter than it had been in weeks. Something had settled in the days before the vote, not a resolution exactly, more like the particular stillness that happens after a long noise stops, and everyone is adjusting to what silence actually sounds like. Ren sat in the human seat. He had his notebook open, but he was not writing. He was watching. The motion had 17 co-signatories when it was filed. It needed 20 to proceed to a binding vote. On the morning of the session, 3 more delegations had sent in their signatures. 2 of them were mid-tier council members who had previously voted with the Vorath bloc on most contested motions. Nobody had asked them to switch. They had switched. Ren had not spoken to either of them personally. He had not needed to. The documentation he had entered into the public record had done the work on its own. 40 years of careful, accurate, undeniable record. It did not require interpretation. It simply sat there and asked to be read. The vote count came up on the chamber display. 31 in favor, 22 against, 7 abstentions. The audit motion passed. Resolution 7 Gamma was suspended pending the outcome of the review. The 3 colony worlds, Varda, Solis Reach, and Outer Keen, were restored to protected status effective immediately. The announcement was sent to all 3 worlds within the hour. On Varda, the news arrived in the early morning, and a school teacher who had been following the situation through patchy relay feeds read it out loud to an empty classroom before her students arrived, just to hear how it sounded. Griv made one final move. He filed a procedural challenge to Earth standing as a council member, citing a technical clause in the original membership charter about disclosure requirements for military assets. It was precise language. It might have worked once. Ren's legal team had been annotating the original charter for 15 years. They had the response filed before Griv's challenge was 20 minutes old. The counterargument was 7 pages long and referenced 43 precedents. The challenge failed before it reached a review panel. Griv sat down. He did not make a statement. He did not look toward the human seat. After the session, Chancellor Bohr sent a private message to Wren's quarters. It asked for a meeting, not official, not recorded. They met in a small room off the main corridor, one of the rooms used for quiet conversations between sessions, with 2 chairs and a narrow window looking out at the orbital dark. Bohr moved slowly. He always had, but today it seemed more pronounced, as if the last few weeks had added weight to the movement. He sat, Wren sat across from him. Bohr was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Why did you wait so long?" Wren thought about the question. It deserved a real answer. "We hoped we would not have to do this," he said. "For a long time we believed the system was capable of correcting itself, that the people within it would eventually notice what it was doing to the smaller members and change course." He paused. "Humans are patient. It is not always a virtue. Sometimes it is just a way of hopping longer than is reasonable." Bohr looked at the window. "When did you stop hopping?" Bohr said. "When they filed 7 Gamma," Wren said. "It was not the worst thing the Council had done, but it was the first time they did it to us, and we understood then that we had been giving the benefit of the doubt to a system that had never extended that benefit to anyone smaller than itself." Bohr nodded slowly. He looked very old in the dim light of the room, not weak, just old, which is a different thing. "The Council will not be the same after this," he said. "No," Wren said, "it will not." "Is that what you wanted?" Wren considered it. "We wanted the colonies to be safe," he said. "We wanted a process that worked fairly. We wanted 40 years of documented harm to mean something." He looked at Bohr steadily. "If the Council being the same was incompatible with those things, then no, we did not want it to be the same." Bohr sat with that for a moment. Then he nodded once slowly and stood. The main chamber filled again in the afternoon for a scheduled session. Most of the press had returned. The gallery was half full. Several delegations were still inside meetings. At the start of session, the chair called for any items held over from the pending queue. A delegate from a small species, the Davari, raised her hand. She had been waiting for floor time for 6 years. The chair checked the log. Her request was the oldest outstanding item in the system. She was called. She walked to the speaking platform. She was smaller than most of the beings in the room, and her translator piece was a slightly older model that added a faint echo to her words. She did not seem nervous. She had prepared for 6 years. She presented her case clearly. Resource rights on a shared transit corridor her world had been using for decades without formal recognition. The argument was straightforward and well documented, and had been dismissed on procedural grounds 4 times before it ever reached a vote. The chamber listened. Not everyone. Some delegates checked communications. One representative from the Moulin Circle drifted slightly. But more eyes were on the platform than had been there in a long time, and the interruptions that would once have come did not come. In the back of the chamber, in the lower tier, Wren Holt sat with his notebook closed on the desk in front of him. He watched the Davari delegate speak. He did not write anything down. He had nothing left to document. The case was still being presented when the session feed cut for the press relay. The reporter covering it for a neutral world outlet wrote 1 line in her notes before expanding it into a full piece. The line said, "Today, for the first time, someone small was listened to." She sent it. Then she looked at the chamber feed for a moment longer, at the Davari delegate still speaking, at the room that was almost, not entirely, but almost, paying attention. She thought that was probably enough to start with.